Economics is a rather young field, or relatively young field. And while the origin of the term may be derived from Greek, mercantilism may be seen as the first economic system. With discovery expeditions and colonialization, the first large-scale international trade, mostly between the hegemon and its settlers in the colonies, evolved, which became also known as imperialism. And with that being said, mercantilism is, in a sense, the economic paradigm of imperialism. Between the 16th and the 18th century, the mercantilist era, trade was considered to be a zero-sum game. So what does that mean? Under mercantilism, it was assumed that gains through exports balance losses through imports. And with that belief to be true, development and economic growth can only rest on trade surpluses. In summary, mercantilism was all about exports being good and imports being bad. And because of the large trade surplus from selling goods and getting money in return, England, for example, possessed large amounts of precious metals. And it is therefore just logical that a country's wealth was then also defined by the amount of precious metals it owned. And this concept became known as bullionism, under which the exportation of money was restricted too. And based on this mindset, two important architects of mercantilism stand out. In France, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the finance minister at the time, and also the architect of the French mercantilist system. And he emphasized the importance of coerced trade, agricultural self-sufficiency, and a strong military to uphold the mercantilist system. And in England, it was the Navigation Acts that ensured that all value added associated with the transportation of goods and services needed to be secured by the English. Thus, non-English service providers, such as the Dutch, who had a large fleet to provide transportation services, had to be taxed so that England would get a slice of the pie as well. The entire mercantilist system was built on resources extraction and money export restrictions, which obviously could not go well forever in itself. On the one hand, there was the Dutch, a rather liberal-minded people with a large fleet, and before the Navigation Acts, the Dutch held the largest merchant fleet and controlled the sea routes around Europe. But with the Navigation Acts, however, the English increased shipping, interfering with the Dutch economy. As a consequence, the Dutch and the English engaged in multiple naval wars to gain control over the trade routes. Controlling trade routes was very important, if not to say essential, to sustain the triangle trade, which was the core of the mercantilist business system. And within that system, the hegemon produced and sold manufactured goods to its settlers in the colonies, and especially the African colonies were necessary to supply free or unpaid labor to extract and produce raw materials such as precious metals and cotton from the colonies, which were then shipped to the hegemon's home country. So in summary, the mercantilist business model, or the idea of securing export surpluses, was reliant on slaves as costless workers to extract and produce raw materials at minimal cost. Thus, slave trade and slavery and its horrors were a cruel requirement for the hegemon's enrichment, a one-sided enrichment at the expense of so many others, so to say. Soon, the East India Trading Company monopolized the trade between England and its colonies. And one of the goods they traded was tea, which they sold to colonist wholesalers. As a consequence of England pursuing mercantilist policies, the prices for tea, however, increased substantially. How is that? Well, constant trade surpluses lead to an increase in wealth defined by the amount of precious metals and or hard currency. And when exports exceed imports, more and more money is accumulated and available for fewer and fewer goods. And when this happens, the currency devaluates or loses its value and prices increase, which is an economic phenomenon you probably have heard of as inflation. And this is exactly what happened as a consequence of mercantilist policies. And in order to bypass high prices, colonist wholesalers began to smuggle in tea from the Dutch. And obviously this was a threat to the East India Trading Company in England, where huge amounts of tea started to simply rot away. Therefore, to prevent the colonist wholesalers from driving the East India Trading Company out of business, England, the hegemon, allowed to dump huge amounts of cheap tea into North America, practically flooding the North American market with the huge amounts of tea at extremely cheap prices. North American colonists, however, or the Boston merchant elite more specifically, destroyed the English tea shipment that was destined to the North American colonies, which then became known as the Boston Tea Party. But discontent among the colonist merchant elites accumulated since they were no longer willing to share their increasing wealth with England, and that ultimately led to the Declaration of Independence and the end of the mercantilist era. So what can we learn from mercantilism? Mercantilist and or protectionist policies are ultimately not a peace-building formula. There is just so much conflict potential. On the contrary, it creates a hostile environment that breeds discontent and makes conflict even more likely. Also, mercantilist policies rely on trade surpluses, meaning that manufacturers flow out and money flows in. Yet the more money is available in an economy, the less it is worth. And this phenomenon called inflation is essential to macroeconomics, which we will also cover later this semester. In the 17th century, new ideas started to spread, propagated by a new intellectual movement that emphasized reason and individualism rather than tradition, which was also the spirit that had already brought about the Declaration of Independence in the US and then later in many other colonies. The Enlightenment, which is how this movement is called, rang in a philosophical, social, political, and economic change. And with the emphasis on reason and individualism, ever more people followed the Protestant Church, because in contrary to the Catholic Church, Protestantism did not despise property, giving the common people resources. And medieval rule, preaching the subordination of the individual to the church, lost more and more its credibility. David Hume, a philosopher, was able to show that mercantilism was not a sustainable system. He came up with the price specie flow mechanism, and the price specie flow mechanism states that constant trade surpluses lead to an inflow of species like gold and silver. The inflow of gold and silver in turn increases the money supply and causes prices to rise. And with inflation happening, imports become cheaper. So people start demanding more and more imported goods. Another very important philosopher during Enlightenment was Adam Smith. And he's nowadays also called the father of modern economics. And he published his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, in 1776, arguing that both parties benefit from trade, since specialization creates economies of scale. And he further argued that the present relationship between government and industry was harmful to the general people, bringing about a shift regarding the relationship of the individual to the state, towards the subordination of the state to the individual. And this philosophical shift of enlightenment led further to more political freedom and economic liberalism, which allowed for the Industrial Revolution to happen, during which the development of seeds initiated an agricultural revolution, and the invention of the weaving machine enhanced textile production, and installation of electricity and the invention of light bulbs prolonged the working day, and the invention of the steam engine facilitated metal welding, and the steam train and the steamboat contributed highly to transportation. And long-distance communication was finally possible in very short time periods due to the invention of the telegraph. So what can we learn from this era, from the 17th and 18th century, the era of Enlightenment? Well, Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution highlight inflation as a consequence of protectionist policies and emphasize the advantages of international trade. And in topic 3, we will learn about David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which shows that trade is actually beneficial to everyone. And in topic GDP and economic growth, we will touch on innovation as a driving force of an economy as well.